Okay, so welcome to the Clinical Forum Supporting Families and Ourselves During Challenging Times. My name is Dr. Dixelia López. I'm from the Guidance and Child Studies Center at PNW BOCES. The title of this workshop is International Psychology, Resilience, and COVID-19. As part of the Guidance and Child Studies Center, we exist to provide an array of services and professional development opportunities to ensure pathways to success for every student. With a focus on marginalized students, the students with disabilities, students of color, and ENL students, etc. This is the rest of my team. Dr. Andrew Eckert is the coordinator of the Child Guidance and Studies Center. We have Louise Dutra, our secretary to school administrator, who is joining us today and is helping us again moderate the questions throughout, as well as Megan King and Deborah Lapadula, who's also part of our Guidance and Child Studies Center team at PNW BOCES. So first, I wanted to say thank you for your time today and for joining me. I know this is a very stressful time for all of us, and I know that we have been putting a lot of energy and support into our students, into our families, both from at home, those families at home, and the families that we are responsible for in terms of our profession. So first, we wanted to give ourselves the opportunity to take time for ourselves. So what we're going to do is first do a mindful moment or a mindful minute. So make sure you're sitting in a comfortable position. So we'll go through that first. So make sure that we take this time to give ourselves permission to do that. The presentation goals are listed herein, as well as at the end, we're going to share some resources and maybe some strategies. And we will hear first from Mabel Jimenez, who is a social worker from Austin, who is joining us as well today. So welcome, everyone. So please make sure you're sitting comfortable in your chair. You can do this with your eyes closed or open. I'll have them open because I will be reading. I see there are some people who are joining us still right now, so give me a moment. So we'll start with our mindful minute first. So okay, so I want you to just sit down relax your shoulders. All you have to do is just be still and focus on your breath for just 1 minute. Breathing in deeply. And out slowly. One breath cycle should last for approximately 6 seconds. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. Letting your breath flow effortlessly in and out of your body. Letting go of your thoughts, noticing them without judgment. Let go of the things you have to do later today or pending projects. Simply focusing on the attention to the present moment. Letting your chest rise and fall. Watching with your awareness as it works its way up and out of your mouth, and its energy dissipates into the world. Thank you for that. I felt so relaxing even in guiding it. So thank you for joining me again. For those of you who came in just now, we are talking about international psychology, resilience, and COVID-19 today, and how it all relates to programming efforts now and in the future. And we'll be sharing some resources from people in the community today as well. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Again, Dixelia López, bilingual school psychologist. I've been practicing as a bilingual school psychologist for about 17 years. But aside of being a bilingual school psychologist, I'm also what we call an international psychologist. And international psychology is what I've chose to do my doctorate in, actually. As school psychologist, I felt that we were very focused on the individual and what happens within the individual child, for example, or individual students. However, I felt that there was more to that, right? There's ecological systems around that child that affect the child's development. So after looking through some vast variety of different programs, I stumbled upon international psychology. And the international psychology framework is one that is contextually and culturally inclusive and informed. It is focusing on the public interest and promoting global perspectives. It also takes into account psychological principles to the development of public policy, and looks at both the individual and or group consequences of global events. And as we think about the global events that is happening right now, which is COVID-19 or the pandemic, international psychology is quite relevant. My studies in international psychology was focused on community trauma and what happens to the individual during such circumstances. Of course, I've never studied or been through this particular community trauma that we're all in now. However, through my research with the refugee population from Myanmar and Burma, I'm going to explain how international psychology was relevant for that population and how the research findings that were resulted in my studies can be applied to the situation that we're in today, and the questions that we should be asking in moving forward. So with that said, let's just talk a little bit about resilience and what is resilience? How do we conceptualize it first? Of course, resilience presupposes a certain amount of stress, right? Or trauma, whether we call it traumatic stress or stress in general. And there are a lot of research findings out there that talk about what we call the Western lens for the resilience framework. One that is individualistic, that talks about the internal factors or the contributing factors within the individual that foster or impede resilience. So it's really sort of a pathological model. Now, what we see that in my studies and just in noticing the families that a lot of us work with, whether it is English language learner or students who are from China or Japan or the African American community, the Latino community, those students come from families who are more collectivistic in nature. And what that means is that the ability to navigate through psychosocial, cultural factors are contextual in nature. And I'm gonna explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So resilience in a collectivistic culture is seen as a bidirectional interaction among the individual, their interactions with each other, with the environment, and within a certain contextual framework. So as an individual, for example, just using myself for the context here to kind of help explain what I'm talking about. I always felt that my coping abilities or capabilities for pre-COVID were fostered more resilience at work versus at home, meaning that I felt that if something went wrong at work, I felt that was more able to recover from that um, at work versus at home. So resilience is contextual in that one may be maybe more devastated if something personal is happening to us versus with at work because of the structures of quote unquote what professionalism should look like, or because maybe you're in an informal leadership position or formal leadership position and have other people that you're responsible for, and therefore your capability to be more resilient at work may be more fostered in that environment. Or you may be someone who is the opposite, who may feel more resilient at home, or that you have more control over your environment at home, and therefore resilience is more fostered at home than at work. So that was pre-COVID, right? Once we saw that this pandemic was really getting serious, or that I saw that this pandemic was something to worry about, that forced us to look at ourselves as individuals first, right? But also it relates to the impact we have upon others. And for me, I could no longer simply focus on my own resilience. I had to think about the resources, the supports, the mechanisms that needed to be in place so that my immediate family was taken care of, right? So I had to think about the immediate resources that were available to me, whether I needed to go shopping, for example. And then I was able to focus on my my mother, for example, extended family members. What resources do they have available? What can I do to support them? And then once that was at a certain level, then I focused on the community as a whole, both within my immediate environment and at work. So that resilience is then seen as a multifaceted social ecological framework that is more broad and complex within the present COVID area that we're in, and that happens with any trauma. So whether it's the trauma of conjured up by natural disasters, for example, an earthquake, a flood, that is what goes through the minds of the individual as one that is connected with their family and their community. Which then relates to my research. So my research was on the refugee population from Myanmar, Burma, and resettlement. And resettlement meaning what happens once this population comes into Albany, New York, which is where this particular study took place. And how the research at the time was defining resilience in terms of the individualistic Western nature, obviously was not relevant to this particular population, and it's not relevant to many of the population of the students that we serve today, specifically, like I mentioned, the students who come from more collectivistic cultures. So the way they defined resilience was more in terms of these factors. The ability to sustain a sense of gratitude and positive outlook, the strong work ethic and perseverance, their social connections and alliances, and their sense of community belonging and purpose. And I'm going to go through each of them momentarily. And the first one, for example, should not be a surprise, because we've always talked about our ability to sustain a sense of gratitude and positive outlook as a resilient framework, right? So this is not new. We always have talked about the power of positive thinking, the power of gratitude, and that's basically what they were talking about here in terms of the participants were in seeing the world as half full versus half empty. So you're more likely to be resilient, to thrive beyond your current circumstances if you have a positive outlook of life in general. In terms of a strong work ethic and perseverance, what we saw was that those who related the connection between how hard they worked to more positive outcomes did better in life, really, in managing their current circumstances as well. And that goes along with this idea that the more control we perceive around the circumstances that we are in, the better the outcome. The next one, in terms of social connections, is also something that we intuitively all know as clinicians and as educators, is that it is important to develop a sense of community, but not only for the sense of community itself, but also for navigating communal resources. And what I mean by that is that I do not only need to feel that I'm connected with other people, but I also need to know who to go to tap into different resources. Whether that's how to ride a bus or apply for medical care or translation services, or who to borrow money for rent and things like that. So in terms of the strong connection to other people, it is beyond that communal relationship. It's also on who can I depend on when there is trouble, when I feel discomfort. In terms of the sense of community belonging and purpose, one of the things that was found in the research is that upon arrival, the seniors were no longer living with extended family networks, and most of them were now living alone. And so they felt the lack of community belonging and purpose, which was ultimately inhibiting their ability to be resilient. In terms of resilience contributors, as we all know, resilience presupposes the presence of stress or barriers. So as part of the research, I wanted to know what facilitates or inhibits resilience in this particular community. The first one should not be a surprise for any of us. For any immigrant or refugee group that does not know the English language, supportive resources surrounding equitable language access is vital. To this point, they relied on volunteers for language support, like reading a bill, and went to classes to learn English. However, we found that students and women were most able to benefit from these resources, and the men often worked along, and and the elderly often lacked the support and confidence to go outdoors. And so the women who were home were the ones who were able to benefit from the linguistic resources that were available. In terms of cultural pride, community, and belonging, they organized cultural celebrations and maintained their cultural identity. So they felt that they were already created their own community networks, and we've seen that all over New York State, whether it's Chinatown. I know in Mount Vernon, there's a supportive group of Dominican communities. In Harrison and other places, there may be a supportive group of Japanese communities where people are gathered and together to celebrate their cultural authenticity, per se. Supportive civil society referred to the fact that this population needed to feel safe and secure, that they can come and go as they please. A lot of them, if not 100% of them, really came from refugee camps. So they didn't feel safe. And so this idea of safety within the community that people belong in is highly important. And when we think about maybe the Latino African American communities, sometimes they do not feel that there is a supportive civil society. And so therefore, their ability to be resilient may be inhibited because of that. And that is something that they can't necessarily control. It's outside of themselves. To that notion, we all know that surviving precedes thriving, right? So that the basic needs, the psychological safety needs of our children and families need to be adhered to first before we can foster resilience. And on the right hand of your screen, you see that this is sort of a diagram that was generated as part of the results section of this particular research, in terms of that at the center was the social supports and the mechanisms for that social support. So for example, whether it's a clergy or a pastor that was supportive to the community, this particular community had two religious figures that kind of were what I call the stakeholders of the community that organized and provided information and that the community trusted. And so when we're thinking about the supports that we can give to our communities, what are some of the people in our communities that are held in high regard? We also saw social support mechanisms in terms of individuals within and outside the groups themselves. So not only within the groups who had certain skill sets, but also outside the groups and community agencies. And all of this revolved around the supports of employment, education and culture, health and safety, and language. So that there was an interconnection of the individual with the context that they were living in. So how does this relate to what is happening now? Well, when we're talking about intervention and prevention efforts, and I left the word prevention here because we're talking about intervention in terms of what we're doing now as clinicians and as educators or as leaders, but also as prevention in terms of what we're doing post-COVID, right? What's happening after this pandemic kind of subsides and we are hopefully going back to quote unquote some sense of normalcy. What are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves now and into the future when we're talking about supporting children in our communities, right? So these are some of the questions that I wanted to highlight that are actually come from my own research, like I mentioned, on resilience within this collectivistic community. And I think that is very relevant to the situations that we are today and what's happening. So some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, for example, how does language learning needs impact individuals in the community? So one of the things that revolves around this question is this idea of access. So if we are giving out computerized technology to make sure that our families have access to that, do they also have access to how to navigate Google Classroom in their native language, for example? How do we know that the type and length of support is effective? Have we asked our families what they need? And some districts are doing this very well, and some may not have been thinking about it because there is so much to do and so much to think about. But have we made sure that we ask our families, okay, do you need food? Are you okay with your rent? Is there anything that we can support with that? Is there anyone sick at home? So basically making sure that those basic needs are met before we, let's say, assume that a family may not be interested in the child's education because the child has not logged into a certain platform that we're advocating for. Other questions: how can diverse community agencies collaborate to mitigate the effects of language and culture in assessing community resources and social support networks? So what platforms are we using to communicate with our families, and are we being intentional about collaborative efforts, or are we all kind of scrambling individually, doing the same thing? And I think that is one of the things that I'll be talking about in the second half in terms of the sharing of resources and posing out to other participants, is how can we collaborate more effectively so that we are intentional about the work and, as they say, work smarter, not harder, because I know we all have a lot to do. What social support networks or mechanisms are available, and what more can be put in place to maximize resilient outcomes? Again, we may not be able to address that question now, but it's something to continuously think about or have in the back of our minds in the future. What are the strengths of individuals and community in terms of values, beliefs, and skills? How can we harness the strengths to reach more favorable outcomes? Are there any other needs like food, shelter, medical, transportation, and what programming efforts can be put in place? I know that we have some communities who are more spread out than others, and so transportation to get packets or what the student needs or food may be challenging for some of our families. And how can we continue to advocate as clinicians or as educators in informing our school leaders or officials about the needs of children, parents, and communities? And in addition to that, that also includes the ability to navigate this new system of remote learning. So in general, what is already in place in our communities to help our families? What improvements can be made now? And what do we anticipate may be the needs and potential solutions for the future? So I'm going to stop recording and sharing and see if there's any questions.